Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Sisters and brothers, theys and thems, all you citizens of the world, welcome to another edition of the Live from the Heartland show. I'm Michael James here in Chicago's 49th Ward, and we have two really wonderful guests for our week of February 13th. We're going to have our old pal Jeff Biggers, who's going to talk to us about ice in Italy and the time of the Olympics. And then Paul Draus, who was one of the original hosts of the Live from the Heartland show up there in Michigan, going to talk to us a little bit about a recent visit to Rwanda, teaching Moby Dick in prison around authoritarianism and the new Gordie Howe Bridge between Ontario and Detroit, between Windsor and Detroit, that Trump threatens not to open. So we're really glad you're here, wherever you're listening or viewing from, wherever you've been, wherever you're going. We'd love to welcome you to the Live from the Heartland show. You can see us anytime at youtube.com/heartlandmedia/videos. Plenty of other places too. And if you really like the show and like to help support it, we could use that support. Contact us at livefromtheheartlandshow@gmail.com. Okay. I'm going to give you a little highlight about what's coming up next week. We're going to have Floyd Webb and Peter Hudis. They're both Frantz Fanon experts, and they're going to talk about a new film called Fanon. And people who may not know who Frantz Fanon was, he was a psychiatrist and revolutionary thinker. He wrote a beautiful book, a serious book called The Wretched of the Earth. And this new film is going to be shown, I believe, on the 26th, a Thursday night, at the Logan Center, 915 East 60th Street in Hyde Park here in Chicago. So with all that said, we're going to take a short musical break, and we'll be right back with our first guest. Stay tuned here on the left end of your dial, or however you're getting the Live from the Heartland show.
Trallallera è un canto d'amore. Cantano soli gli sposi quando dormono piore. Cantano soli gli sposi quando dormono piore. Ninna nanna sei un soli verso amo li ricordi. Trallallera la rilla la. Ninna nanna sei un soli verso amo li ricordi. Trallallera la rilla la.
Citizens of the world, welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of February 13th. I'm still Michael James up here in Chicago's 49th Ward, and our first guest today is a pal who's been on the show a number of times, the one and only Jeff Biggers. We're going out to Iowa to talk with him about Italy. Jeff has a number of books out. He's a pretty prolific author. He wrote a book called Reclaiming an American Tradition. He wrote a book, In Sardinia, An Unexpected Journey in Italy. He did a book, United States of Appalachia, or Appalachia, however people do it. He did In the Sierra Madre, and he did a wonderful thriller with our other friend, Andy Davis, called Disturbing the Bones, about a civil rights worker killed down in southern Illinois, and it goes on from there. That someday will be made into a movie, we hope. And in the interim, we're going to talk about Italy. A lot of people are watching the Olympics these days. Jeff just did a piece called Minneapolis to Milan, Italy's Olympic message against ICE takeover, and take center stage. So how about filling us in about what took you to Italy this time? I know you're working on a new book about women in Bologna, I think. But you're back and forth a lot. So fill us in, Jeff.
Great, Michael. Thanks for having me on your show as always. It's always a pleasure to talk. And it does seem far away, from Iowa to Illinois to Italy. But in fact, it's a pretty small world at what people are focusing on right now. I've been going back and forth between here and Italy since 1989. In fact, if I have to actually say I have a home on this planet, it probably is Bologna, Italy, where I've been based part-time since 1989, in fact. And I was back there this winter working on a new book, a cultural history, looking at how Bologna has been uniquely a progressive city. And at the meantime, I was overwhelmed by how many Italians are paying attention to what's happening in the States, obviously under the Trump regime, but more importantly, focusing on what's happening with the recent sweeps and policies of ICE, specifically going into Minneapolis. You know, last week, Michael, was incredible. Thousands of people poured into the piazza April 25th of Milan, calling for the removal of ICE, not only from their own cities, but also from Minneapolis. And by their own cities, what they're referring to is the Olympics. You know, ICE has its own investigative unit that travels internationally at certain important events like the Olympics and other kind of international venues. And when the Italians found out that there would be representatives, not so much agents, but representatives from ICE at the Olympics, they immediately poured into the piazzas in protest and demanded that they would be removed and there would be no contact whatsoever. And I thought, really, this is the beginning, I think, of a reminder that the whole world is watching what is happening in the United States, specifically with the madness we're seeing right now with ICE.
Yeah, they are. People are watching. You know, I saw a clip of Vance in a vehicle kind of hightailing it out of Milan or out of the center of Milan. And I think that he was booed at the opening ceremony. I don't know if Rubio was also there and booed, but we were liking the Italians for booing the vice president of the United States.
Right.
So talk a little bit more about the protests against ICE in Italy and what the general vibe is among Italians around the United States these days.
Right. Of course, we have to point out, of course, that when Vance and Rubio were there at the opening on Friday and Saturday, there was quite a clamor and a protest. And of course, that was edited out by NBC TV and other news outlets. But the Italians recognized it. And of course, as we know, the current prime minister of Italy, her name is Giorgia Meloni, is a right-wing, member there who very much is fawning over Trump and trying to kind of walk a tightrope between supporting Trump and then listening to what's happening in the country. I think what it's great is the Italians are making it very clear, the Italians in terms of the general populace, that they don't want to have anything to do with the Trump administration, especially these immigration policies. I mean, these protests to me are really important to point out, Michael, for a few reasons. One is not only that the whole world is watching. I was flabbergasted by how Italians I would just meet in the streets in Bologna and other parts, even in Sardinia, knew every detail. They almost are news junkies when it comes to what's happening in the United States. And they knew every detail about what happened to Rene Good and Alex Priti and so many of the tragedies we're seeing with ICE and how many people have been deported and detained and pulled out of their cars. And once again, the actual details should be a reminder to Americans that we need to be paying attention. You know, this morning I got a text from a dear friend of mine, an old friend from Appalachia who lives now in Minneapolis. And she says, essentially it hasn't stopped. It's relentless. She just to get to the hospital with a friend, they had to go through various roadblocks. And they're seeing people who are being pulled out of their cars that still ICE may not have the massive presence that it had, a couple of weeks ago, but it's still there. It's still a very vicious occupation. The second thing I think that's very important, Michael, for us to talk about is that the Italians are making the global connection to what's happening with immigration. They're making the global connection to what's happening in terms of crackdown of democratic protests. They're saying what really is the difference between what happened with the tragedies in Iran and the tragedies in other countries. And then now you see Americans going into the streets and being, assaulted by ICE and whatnot. And that, once again, do we have a democratic right to protest, to the First Amendment? And the Italians are making that global connection. I think the third thing that's very important is that they're saying the perception of America, and this is in NPR reported this, a young student in Milan said, the perception of America has changed. And I think that's very important. When you have the mayor of Milan say, we don't want anything to do with these militias, these thugs, these killers from the United States, I think you have really, there's a major shift in how one of our greatest allies, the people who have some of the greatest gratitude for our liberation from the Nazis in World War II, now see us in a different light of who we are.
Jeff, you can talk a little bit more about Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister. She is the leader of the right-wing Brothers of Italy. And, Italy has gone back and forth between left-wing governments and right-wing governments. Is the climate changing around her, or is she kind of insulated from all of this in some way?
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation because she was elected as part of an alliance, a coalition politics. As you know, in Italy, there's just an extraordinary number of political parties, and each of them get a little percentage, and then they build these coalitions. So the coalitions themselves are quite fragile. So Meloni both has to appease members of her right-wing coalition, but at the same time, fearing that, her own party could go down at any second. As we know, Italy is famous because the government has collapsed at least 40, 45 times since World War II over very little issues because once again, the support of the coalitions are quite fragile. If someone has 5-6%, they can pull out, and that's the end of the coalition. That's the end of the government. So Meloni's trying to have it both ways. She herself only won 28% of the vote. So put that in context in terms of really how much the support.
Say that again, 28%?
Yeah, when she was in the elections, her party only got 28%, and then they were able to cobble together a 50%, bringing together other centrist and centrist parties. So she has to be very careful. And of course, as we know, she's been careful about attacking Trump. She's been reticent about Greenland. She was not as vocal as Macron and Starmer and the leaders from Germany were. She's been supportive of Zelensky, but she's played it kind of both ways. And she's very close to Orban, of course, in Hungary. So she definitely continues her trajectory as a right-wing, quasi-fascist leader. But she, at the same time, is aware of the global dynamics of politics. I think what's important for her is the historical context, Michael. I mean, when the protesters went into the streets of Milan last week, they picked a specific piazza, a specific square, and that was Piazza April 25th, because April 25th is the day of liberation in Italy, when the Americans and the Allies liberated and basically got the Nazis and the fascists out. And I think the protesters in Italy picked that piazza for a reason, to say, hey, here we are looking at the historical context of authoritarian governments, of tyranny, of Nazis, of fascists, and how once again we're seeing that in whatever shape or form is beginning to creep up again in other parts of the world. And they wanted to point out that, in fact, Americans and Italians had been allies to take on tyranny and to take on fascism and take on the Nazis.
What's your sense from living in Bologna of the climate of the Italian politics? Is it moving to the left, or will she be there for a while?
It's a great question. They struggle with their economy right now, and they go back and forth. I think many respects in our own country, they're awaiting a new generation of young leaders to come along, especially women leaders. The head of the Democratic Party is a young woman now who actually is from the Bologna area. But I think we've yet to see kind of a center-left coalition emerge that can take on the center-rights. So in many respects, Italy is, I think, struggling to come into this new age. And I think what we're hoping is that there will be leadership, just like hopefully there'll be new leadership in the Democratic Party here in the United States, specifically among women, to help pull us through. So it's a very critical moment right now in Italy. And I think Meloni is trying very hard to focus on the economy. Of course, her message is very anti-immigrant. That's how she was elected, when, of course, the immigration issue is a fraction of you would have in other countries. But she's basically has yet to really come through with anything, I think, that supports a stronger economy or a stronger Italy.
We see this people on the move throughout the world. Climate change, political turmoil, numbers of reasons, but people are leaving their homelands looking for a better life. And very often they're getting vilified, not only here in the United States, but clearly in Europe in a number of places. We saw in Ireland some anti-immigrant demonstrations lately. Is that pretty common among people in general? Is that widespread, or is that, how big a deal is it? Probably pretty big deal. But
yeah, it's huge. And I think we're at the tip of the iceberg. As we know, this week, the Trump administration is going to try to end one of the most important acts we have, which measures the level of CO2 emissions from power plants. And if they, in fact, repeal that, we're talking really a full-scale onslaught in the environment and a continual slide into climate chaos. No one understands that better, I think, than people in the Mediterranean, because here we are in an area which is on the cusp, on the border, really, of Africa and the sub-Saharan Africa, where you still now have so many countries that are struggling to have a sustainable economy, a sustainable way of living, because of encroaching desertification, because of flooding, because of drought, and all these issues. And so the issue of climate chaos and the climate crisis, I think, as you point out, is completely connected to the issue of migration and people having to leave. For another time, we can talk sometime, Michael. One of the most horrific parts of the Italian policy is that for years, and this is not just under Meloni, but also under Democratic administrations, they have paid the Libyans to detain immigrants there. In fact, there was an amazing book called The Fourth Time We Drowned by an Irish journalist who pointed out this horrific policy that Europe, not just Italy, but all of Europe, has been, trying to rely on right-wing militias and other militias within Northern Africa, specifically in Libya, to detain any kind of migrants from making the passage by boat into southern Italy and then further into Europe. And I think this is just, once again, the tip of the iceberg of so many migrants that we're going to be having due to the climate crisis.
You mentioned Trump and kind of repealing or pulling back on the environmental laws that seem to be moving us in a good direction. Yesterday, I heard conflicting views on electric vehicles. I saw some reporting that Ford had losing billions of dollars as they've transitioned back to either both gas and electric combined or just to gas. And then I also heard a report on public radio about how the price of electric vehicles has gone down, how good they are, and how the used market for them is increasing. It's just like, we get these conflicting views from, I'm looking forward to an electric vehicle someday. Although I love being in garages with the smell of gasoline and working on old cars. Let me throw in here right now just a little bit on the Olympics. Trump badmouthed one of the Olympians from the United States for speaking out about ice. And all of a sudden, Trump badmouths this person. And then a number of other Olympians from the United States and other places have come to the fore to defend them and being critical of Trump. Any sense around that?
I read about that as well, and I found it very courageous and very inspiring. I think athletes, as you know, have a long time standing tradition of saying, as representatives of their country, they're not necessarily representatives of an authoritarian policy. And I think we've seen that all the way back to the 60s, to even back to Jesse Owens during the Olympics in the 1930s.
Right.
I think athletes play an incredible role, because they're there as representatives of our country, but what part of our country? I think they're there to remind us of democracy, of diversity, of equality, of unity. And I think all those things are very important. And therefore, I think it's amazing to have athletes speak out and say, I represent a country that's based on diversity. It's based on fairness. It's based on equality, and it's based on justice. And that is not particularly what's happening in our country. And I feel very uncomfortable with it. And so I think it's great. I think the mere fact that Trump intervenes and speaks out is showing you, once again, the impact they're having. And I think we can kind of swoop back into that, Michael, that once again, I just want to make it very clear, the world is watching what is happening. And I think the world has been watching. You know, as a historian, one thing that makes me fascinated is to see how we go in these cycles of authoritarian reign. You know, in 1787, for example, John Adams, you know, our second president, who was a bit of an authoritarian himself, but he wrote a book defending our Constitution. And he looked at the other examples of what was happening in Europe and why the Americans needed a three-tier branch of government, why we were going to be different than what was happening in Europe. And he used Bologna, Italy, as one of the examples. He said, here is this great enlightened city where the first university in Europe ever took root 1,000 years ago. And yet they lost their sense of integrity when they gave power to the authoritarian rule of a single person. And he said, Bologna, like Italy, is the warning to the rest of the world. He wrote this in the 1700s. If we don't avoid tyranny, that we must resist at whatever cost of putting power in the hands of a single person. And that's John Adams, our second president, warning us. And I think that warning, here we are, 200 years later, 250 years later, is very important for us to remember what we're going through right now. And I think Italy is the great warning for us, but also they're the great reminder for us that we have to be very aware of what's happening in the global context.
Well, Jeff, you were over in Italy where they have snow in the mountains, or they have to manufacture snow. I'm not sure what's happening this time. And you're back in Iowa where there's been plenty of snow, I imagine. What do you got to say about the future of America and the climate today and how people of conscience can move to make it a better day?
You know, Michael, I look out my office right here and I can see the Mississippi River. And it was frozen over last week, completely iced in. And of course, that's wonderful because we get to see the eagles who come and try to fish. But that ice is gone. And I think that's a great metaphor that as long as we hold the line, as long as we continue to get out in the streets, as long as we continue to show solidarity, as long as we continue to bring out the truth from the darkness and light as journalists, as writers, as radio people like yourselves, as storytellers, that ice will thaw and the river will keep flowing and we will continue to progress forward. And I'm an optimist. You know, as a historian, you see that we go through these crises, but we also see that we rise to the occasion and move forward. And you've been a big part of that. And I kind of foresee that in the future, especially here in the great Midwest.
One final thing. We got a minute or so left. Tell people once again, the last time you were on our show, you were talking along with Andy Davis about your new book together called Disturbing the Bones. And I don't know how it's sold or what's happened with it, but I got to say it was a terrific book. Not only do you guys talk nicely about me at the end, but for introducing you, but it was real exciting. And of course, it takes place in a couple of places we both know well, Chicago and Southern Illinois. Tell our readers a bit about it, and then we'll end up.
Sure. You know, think about it. You're the one who created the whole project to begin with by introducing me to Andrew Davis there at the Heartland Cafe, 10 years ago, probably. And Andy, of course, being the great filmmaker of Chicago, and, he wanted to work with me coming from Southern Illinois. And the idea of a detective finding bones from Southern Illinois, a detective who now works in Chicago, but originally was from Carroll, Illinois, and having to go back into history and to understand what happened. And of course, that history now is showing up in daily politics. And that's what the novel really was, is how we still grapple with our history, our issues of racism and our issues of justice, and how it took people coming together to really come up with a solution. While meanwhile, we have all sorts of intrigue and hijinks and great fugitive work. Now, let me finish with this. Andrew Davis came to Bologna last summer, and Bologna has the world's greatest cinema, this massive outdoor cinema they set up in the piazza. We had 3,000 people in the piazza, this massive screen. I've never seen anything quite like it. The New Yorker magazine actually, in fact, had a huge spread on it. And there they played The Fugitive. And there you were, Michael. And fugitive. And Andy was there. He got a standing ovation. We had to drag him away from so many people who wanted his autograph. And it was just a beautiful way to once again show the impact that his work has had all over these many decades to tell an incredible story from Chicago to Bologna to around the world.
Jeff Biggers, I want to thank you for joining us. Someday maybe I'll see you in Bologna. More likely I'll see you in Davenport, Iowa, across the Mississippi River. Tell people how they can get a hold of you if they want to be in touch and if you'd like to share it.
Sure. The easiest way, of course, is my website, jeffbiggers.com, has all sorts of information and ways to contact.
All right. You keep doing good in the world, brother. We're glad to have you on, and we'll see you before you know it.
Onward, Michael. Talk to you soon.
Everybody else, you stay tuned here on the left end of your dial or however you're getting it, whether it's on YouTube or on stream or on a radio station or on a podcast. We're really glad you're listening in. We're going to take a musical break, and we're going to come back with Paul Draus, who was a host once upon a time on this show. Now he's a professor at the University of Michigan up in Dearborn, and he's going to talk about a recent trip to Rwanda. Going to talk about Moby Dick being taught in prison, anti-authoritarianism, and he's going to give us a little bit of insight into the bridge between Detroit and Windsor that Trump threatens to not open. Be right back here on the left end of your dial. Okay, you citizens of the world, we're back. We're back with Live from the Heartland for the week of February 13th. And we're glad that our next guest is someone who's been on the show a lot. Actually, he and I go way back to when we first did this show at the Heartland Cafe. He's the one and only Paul Draus. He was a regular at the Heartland. He lived in Rogers Park. He's from Chicagoland. And he ended up in Dearborn, Michigan, where he is a professor of sociology. And he does a lot of things. And we have designated him as our key Michigan reporter. And he's got a number of things to share with us today. So hello there, Paul.
Hi, Michael. How are you doing today?
I'm good. And it looks great where you are. It looks like you're in Rwanda still.
Well, part of me is still in Rwanda and will stay in Rwanda, but I'm actually in Midtown Detroit right now. That's just my backdrop is from Rwanda.
It could be anywhere where there's mountains, but it's really lush and it's good. So tell us a little bit about Rwanda and why you went there.
So this was my second visit to Rwanda. The first time was in 2019 before the pandemic. And that was originally just to learn more about the post-genocide recovery process in Rwanda. We went for like a week-long immersion training, learning about post-genocide reconciliation and recovery, post-traumatic recovery in Rwanda. And in that time, I learned a lot about what had happened in Rwanda and everything that the country has done since that time. So, more than 30 years ago, I think the 30th anniversary was in 2024. Of the genocide against the Tutsis, which took place in 1994. And I remember, this was when I was working on the Heartland radio show when the genocide in Rwanda was taking place in 1994. I remember, I don't know if it was a topic on the show, but it was certainly something that was in the news at that time.
Definitely was.
Yeah, and so a lot of people's imagination or picture of Rwanda is really stuck in that time. This horrendous event where almost 1 million people were killed in about 90 days. many very, very brutally killed with clubs and machetes, kind of up close massacres of men, women, and children, elderly, and everybody of this category of people known as the Tutsis. And but the nation of Rwanda has made a lot of progress since then. I guess we can use that word. Has made a lot of investments in its people, and has also invested quite significantly in the process of reconciliation and national restorative justice, I guess you would say, or actually transitional justice is, I think, the term that's often used. And so we first went there to learn more about that process, but then we met people, we made friends, and we started collaborating and talking, and that continued, over the years through the pandemic and beyond. And so we made a decision to go back because we want to take students there next year, but we also want to build this relationship and this collaboration because, there are a lot of parallels to places like Detroit with its kind of traumatic history, its history of racial and class conflict and division, and places like Rwanda that have been through this type of division and have kind of gotten to the other side of it. And so we thought there are things that we can learn from them, and there are things that we could apply here in our own context. And of course, while we're in Rwanda, which was from January 17th to the 26th, we were watching the news back home and how our own country was in the middle of quite a pitched conflict.
Yeah.
Which obviously it remains the case. I think it's less of a boil than it was because we were there at the time of the Alex Preddy shooting. So we were in Rwanda at the time. We were hearing the news from Minneapolis about the violence taking place in the streets of our own city. So it was quite a kind of a double picture, to be in lush Rwanda and learning about the process of reconciliation and healing, and then looking at what's happening in our own country.
Yeah, and you could throw in there that at the same time, the U.S. was supporting, whether they want to admit it or not, genocide in Gaza, in Palestine.
That's also a topic that comes up, but not so much in the Rwandan context. I think because a country like Rwanda is a small country, they have had the same president for about 30 years. So the democratic situation in Rwanda has been questioned. But they have to, of course, play on the world stage with world leaders. And so I think like President Kagame or other presidents of African countries are sometimes hesitant to speak out on issues like that because, the U.S. still has a lot of weight in the region. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the shadow of genocide, of course, is still with us today. I mean, and Ukraine too. I mean, because many have argued that the campaign against Ukraine is also a form of genocide, or has genocidal intent to basically eliminate the Ukrainian identity, from the map. So,
well, we got a lot of crisis in the world, no doubt about it. Tell us a little bit more about Rwanda. You mentioned it was not a very large country, but how many people? What is the ethnic makeup? Different, I guess, identifying with different tribes, and like what they produce. I got really no sense of it. I had hoped to do a little more research, but
Rwanda is a very small country. It's in sometimes called the Green Heart of Africa in the African Great Lakes region. So it's in Eastern Africa. It borders the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda on the north, Congo on the west, Tanzania on the east, and Burundi in the south. And it's a small country geographically, but it's also known as the land of 1,000 hills. As you can see, it's very lush. This is actually a photo from a tea plantation. They grow tea, and they grow coffee, they grow rice. It's largely an agricultural country, but it's the most densely populated country in the world, apparently. So even though it's very small, the population is about 14 million, and it's a very young population. So one of the things that we found so appealing about Rwanda is the youth of the population, how many of the people that have grown up post 1994 have this sort of shared sense of purpose and pride in this country. Although there are questions about the political institutions and things like that, people are very, very proud of what they've achieved. In fact, they have a saying in local language of Kinyarwanda that translates as, "We must be the guardians of what we have achieved." And what they have achieved is 30 years of peace, progress in terms of reducing poverty, extending education and gender equality, sustainability, and many other measures. So, it's a small place, but very, very dynamic. I mean, we were just amazed by the number of people out walking, riding bicycles, riding motorcycles, cars, trucks, and people everywhere, but not in the sense of being piled on top of each other. So it's still very much a rural country, except for the main city of Kigali, but is almost this kind of interesting mixture of high tech and low tech. So you have, like I said, people walking and people riding bicycles, but you also have a high level of internet connectivity and people riding electric motorcycles in the city of Kigali and all these kinds of features, because the government there is trying to invest in making the city of the country and the city of the future. So they talk about Rwanda being an example of the African city of the future. So it's a really interesting place.
I hope you and all those students you're going to have a good time, and maybe I'll come too.
Yeah. So one thing we were learning about was the power of laughter too. So one of the guys that was one of our guides there, because we were immersing ourselves in these meetings between survivors and perpetrators of the genocide who now live side by side in what are called reconciliation villages. And they have these meetings with a lot of these folks who are, my age or older, my age to your age, right? And they would use this technique called laughter yoga to engage everybody. It's really incredibly exhilarating, actually. Once you start laughing with people and looking other people in the face and laughing with them, it really gives you a whole other picture of the person in front of you, and it's kind of very, intensely humanizing type of activity. We ended up doing this sort of all over, everywhere we went in Rwanda, because this guy who was one of our guides was like kind of a practitioner or guru of this laughter yoga technique. So that was quite amazing. And
let's switch topics here. And one of the things that you mentioned was you're doing some work in prisons, and you're using the book Moby Dick kind of to educate people around authoritarianism. How about filling us in on that, Paul Draus?
Yeah, so this was something that came out of these sessions we've been doing with people inside a prison that grew out of classes we've been doing there for years. And so we've been doing these kind of creative workshops using storytelling and theater as a way of kind of addressing issues related to incarceration and social justice types of issues. Kind of connecting the stories of guys on the inside, to the experience of people on the outside and things like that. And so we're working with this playwright she's of Egyptian descent, but she's, I think, based in Wisconsin. Her name is Denmo Ibrahim. And we came up with the idea of using a kind of a central text as a way of connecting the stories of the guys in the prison to a larger story, this larger American story. And that's how we kind of settled on this idea of using Moby Dick as a sort of essential text, because I don't know if you've read Moby Dick or when was the last time.
I was just thinking, I haven't read Moby Dick, although I just read East of Eden, which was a big book. And
East of Eden is a sweeping epic. I think in some ways it's more accessible probably to the everyday reader today than Moby Dick, which is this very challenging book. But I think once you get into it, it becomes very transformative. it works on so many different levels, and that's why one of the reasons why we were interested in using it, because there's like 130 chapters. Many of the chapters are short, and Melville just loads it with all these kind of metaphors and symbols that relate to the larger issues of society. And so a lot of questions about, democracy versus totalitarianism, the life on the ship and the solidarity of the sailors on the whaling ship versus, the authoritarian Ahab with his obsessive, pursuit of the white whale. And so it's just rich in all these metaphors. And it was written at a time when the United States was on the verge of breaking apart in 1850, 1851, on the eve of the American Civil War. And a lot of these questions around slavery and freedom and what it meant, what America was about, what America meant, were poised to, rip the country apart. It actually reminds me a lot of, coming back from Rwanda to the war in Minneapolis, and then this whole sort of Super Bowl cultural moment with, kind of America 1 versus America 2, and this world that sort of Bad Bunny represents, which is this world of vibrant diversity and inclusion, and which represents all the things that are great about America to me, but represent exactly what's threatening to a whole set of other Americans, right? And so this is all of this is in Moby Dick. All these dynamics are in Moby Dick, as well as the narrator Ishmael describes, his best friend and, his bunkmate, who's the harpooner Queequeg, who's from a cannibal island in the South Seas, but who's also the most admirable person he's ever met, And so it's just very, very rich. And so we're just kind of starting to delve into it with these guys in the prison. But we're hoping to do like a production out of it at the end.
Well, I got to say, we really liked Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl and what he's doing for America. Mm-hmm. And maybe we should call the big chief guy, the orange-faced guy, maybe we should call him Ahab. Anyhow, let's move along. I woke up yesterday, I think, or a couple of days ago. We're recording a few days before this goes online and airs. But the president of the United States said he was not going to let this new bridge, the Gordie Howe Bridge, between Windsor and Detroit, open. And you're up there and you know what's going on. You're a sociologist. You've worked in these neighborhoods up in Detroit. Talk a little bit about the bridge and what the issues are and what do you think's happening. I know you have a lot of background on it.
Yeah, well, so the Gordie Howe Bridge is a mega project, a mega project in the true sense of, it's a huge, multi-billion-dollar project spanning two countries it's been many years in the making, many years in the building of the bridge. And they finally connected the two spans of the bridge last year in the fall. They kind of came together. In the article I wrote, I talked about, it's like the two sides came together in a kiss, finally after many, many years of work. And I think for most people here, both on the American side and the Canadian side, because, here in Detroit, we have a very close relationship to Canada. I think a lot of people don't think about that, but we're actually located north of Canada here in Detroit. And it's a very close cultural, social, political, and economic relationship because the auto industry, has facilities on both sides, parts flow over every day. And so we have very, very close bonds, and the bridge kind of represented this sort of collaboration between Michigan and Canada. It's funded by the Canadian government, but the money will be paid back over a period of decades through the tolls collected by the Canadian government. But the bridge is actually owned by both the state of Michigan and the Canadian government. So it's very much a collaborative project. They actually got started under our last Republican governor, who was Rick Snyder, who used to call himself one tough nerd. I don't know if you remember Rick Snyder. He's also the guy who got into the Flint water crisis happened under Snyder. But one of his sort of proud achievements was the signing of the agreement for the Gordie Howe Bridge. And so he actually recently wrote an editorial defending the bridge and saying this is, exactly not the leverage point for for Trump to try to get what he wants out of Canada. But there's other factors at work too, because one of the issues in Detroit is that we have had one bridge for many, many years connecting the U.S. and Canada in Detroit. It's called the Ambassador Bridge, and it's a privately owned bridge owned by the Maroon family. Formerly, Matty Maroon was sort of the patriarch of that family. He passed away a few years ago, but now it's his family owns the bridge. And they always wanted to have their own second span, and they wanted to own it. And so when the state of Michigan and the Canadian government, which was adamantly opposed to having two privately owned bridges, at this international crossing, made this deal, the Maroon family was adamantly opposed to it and tried to sue and to slow down the process. It's one of the reasons why it's taken this long. So a part of what's been happening is I think the Maroon family has also been communicating with the current president, Ahab in Washington, and because he's got, he wants to use this as a bludgeon against Mark Carney in Canada too. I think he's trying to use it as a leverage point to have his way with the Canadians. But I don't know that this is going to work. Most people here in Michigan, Republican and Democrat, are big, strong supporters of the bridge. I mean, the big criticism of the bridge here has been the impact that it's having on low-income communities and the sort of the social equity issues related to the environmental impacts and the benefits of the bridge. I mean, who's being impacted and who's benefiting? So that was one of the major issues that I talked about in that article that I wrote, which is a continuing issue here in Detroit. But I think, broadly speaking, in the sort of in the public eye, this is actually a very popular project. And of course, naming it after Gordie Howe, the great Canadian hockey player who played for the Detroit Red Wings, is a sort of unifying cultural figure that kind of connects to both the Canadian and the American sides. So I think Trump, I think this is going to be a dead end for Trump. I think this will be like a passing issue, but we'll see what happens with it.
When was it supposed to actually open? When is it supposed to go into effect?
It's supposed to open in the spring. I mean, it was originally supposed to open in the fall. So I did this article for the conversation in the fall in advance of what was supposed to be the official opening of the bridge. But I mean, they had to do more testing and things like that. So they're now planning to open it in the spring of this year.
Well, they better get it open because there's a lot of Americans want to go to Canada.
Yeah.
And spend their money
maybe not so much the other way. I mean, I think that's one of the things that Trump was saying is like, why should we open this bridge when they don't want to sell our whiskey or our stuff in Canada?
Well, Paul Draus, our Detroit, Michigan, et cetera, reporter guy. We started out talking about massacre in Rwanda, and let's end this with a little discussion of another massacre that happened back in 1932. Mm-hmm. And that would be the Ford Massacre. And you know a lot about it. Fill us in.
Yeah. So in March of 1932, it was the depths of the Great Depression here in Detroit. Many, I think more than 25% of people were out of work. You had a march that was organized by, young communists and many, many others. Of unemployed or underemployed workers, black, white, men, women, all different ages, that marched from the city of Detroit to Dearborn, Michigan, which is where the Ford Rouge plant is located. The Ford Rouge plant being, one of the sort of 9 wonders of the world, and it was, Henry Ford's, amazing technological achievement where they employed tens of thousands of workers and produced, thousands and thousands of vehicles. But during the Great Depression, they had slashed their workforce. And so there was the march was an attempt to confront Henry Ford and to make 14 demands for better treatment and pay of workers. And the workers, about, I think, 3,000 to 5,000 workers met in Detroit, marched along the Rouge River up to Dearborn, and they were met by Ford security led by, his sort of thug-in-chief, Harry Bennett, and Dearborn police, and they were violence broke out. They used, I think, fire hoses and gas, and then bullets on the marchers. And 5 marchers were killed. 4 were killed that day, and another died. one African-American worker died a couple months later of his wounds. So there are 5 workers that died that day, and it became a kind of catalyzing event in the organization of the United Auto Workers, and eventually the unionization of the Rouge plant. In 1937 was the Battle of the Overpass, where Walter Reuther and his brother, I think, confronted Ford's security again, and eventually the Rouge plant was organized. So we commemorate this event every year with an event that we call March On. This year it takes place on the actual day of the Hunger March, which is March 7th of 2026. And we meet at the spot where the workers met in 1932, where we have a monument there at the 4th Street Bridge Park, and we march up Miller Road to Dearborn, and we end at the UAW Local 600, which is the UAW local that was established there after the organization of the Rouge plant. And so the UAW is one of our big partners, a lot of other community partners involved, and some of our local legislators are going to come and say a few words. Rashida Tlaib, who's the representative for Dearborn, Sharif Thanadar, who's the other representative from the other side of the river, and our city council people, and so on. So, and then we have music and celebration and silent auction, and we try and raise some money to support the maintenance of the 4th Street Bridge Park. But yeah, I think this year it's especially kind of symbolically significant, given, the what we've been experiencing, what people have been experiencing in places like Minneapolis and Chicago, in terms of the citizens confronting the armed forces of both private and government security. So.
Yeah, well, it's something else what's going on. There's good things and there's a lot of bad things. March 7th is the date. People might want to go up there. I would love to come, except our sports reporter, Gordon Thompson, who contributes to the show regularly over the years, he's being inducted into the Loyola Sports Hall of Fame that day.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to stay at Loyola for that one.
Yeah.
Paul, I really want to thank you and give my best to your lovely wife and your lovely kids. And we'll have you back next month, and we'll see you before you know it. Everybody else, I want to encourage you to take a listen or a view on youtube.com/heartlandmedia/video. Last week we had Katie Clark, the executive director of the Augsburg Health Commons in Minneapolis. And she gave us a report on what was going on from the street level up there and how it affected people's health, et cetera. We also had Miles Hogarty, Danny Rosa, and Maya Odenthal filling us in on the All Chicago Tenants Alliance. There's a lot of activity among tenants and rent strikes, a number of them here in Rogers Park. And we had the Peter Schulte Good News for Humankind report. He's a monthly contributor. Next week, we got Floyd Webb and Peter Hoodis coming on to talk about Frantz Fanon. And I want to thank everybody who makes this show possible. Our guests today, Jeff Biggers and Paul Draus, our engineer, Hal James, our producers, Lynn Orman, Katie Hogan, and Tom Clark. And once again, I want to encourage you all to do good in the world, because the world needs all the good that we do together. Together, we will win. Over and out till next week. Power to the people.
She can. Over the mountain.
Thank you for watching the Live from the Heartland show.
You got a dream
New
of
episodes
waiting.
air every Friday beginning at 9 a.m. Central Time.
It may
Episodes
not
air
come
each following Thursday on
easy,
Can
but
TV,
you know
9
you've got
p.m.
a friend.
Sweet Home Chicago.
I'll
on
be
Channel
by your
21.
side the entire
Streaming
ride.
everywhere
Just
else
let me
at
hear you say
cantv.org.
amen. Are you doing?
Audio episodes go live on WLUW
Are you
Saturday
doing
9
the
a.m.
best you
on the
can?
left end of your dial at 88.7 FM. We're streaming
Tell
everywhere
me, are you
worldwide at
doing?
WLUW.org.
Are you doing the best you
They're
can?
available on Apple and Spotify podcasts by looking up Live from the Heartland on either platform, and are also broadcast on Lumpen Radio Friday at 9 a.m. on 105.5 FM and streaming at
Too
lumpenradio.com.
done as
I'm Michael James, and I'm glad to have been your host. Until next time, remember, do good in the world because the world needs all the good that you do, that I do, that we do together. All power to the people. Over and out.
Come to Limp. Are you doing the best you can? Tell me, are you doing